you're probably already not stoned if you're a one-time user. Of course, that would not be true for regular users. Now, I talked about the urine testing, and I have to move on to blood testing, which is the gold standard, really, when you're looking at impairment in general, because blood testing can detect the actual psychoactive THC in your system. And this is the stuff, of course, that makes you high. And hopefully you'll never get into a blood test. It takes a lot of trouble to get into a blood test. Usually you have to be hauled into a special nurse or something like that, but in accident situations in particular, they will do this. The blood testing has a completely different profile. Here you're looking at pure THC, and that sharp peak there, the blue line that goes up straight, that is your typical response to smoking a joint. Notice that in minutes, your blood THC soars over 100, and then plummets equally quickly, and then within a couple of hours it's down into single digits, and it rapidly tails off. Generally, for a one-time user, you can detect some THC at a very low level of 1 or 2 nanograms for about 12 hours, maybe, or sometimes at a half nanogram they can detect it. Regular users, however, can show THC in their blood for 48 hours or longer, actually. So medical marijuana smokers will always have a little residual THC in the blood, but at levels on the order of 1 or 2 nanograms. Now, they can also test for the metabolite, the inactive metabolite that they test for in urine testing. You can look for that in a blood test as well. And that is the second, the dotted line B, THC-COOH. And this stuff does show up in the blood system much longer, as in the urine, as you can see, and then hangs around there for, this was 8 hours, but it can hang in there for a couple, 3 days, just as in your urine. This is important because some people say, hey, I just flunked a blood test. I say, oh my God, that's bad news. So what do you have? Well, it showed THC acid. Well, did it THC acid? Well, that's irrelevant. That's irrelevant. If there's no THC in it, and there's only THC acid, they must have smoked a long time ago. Lots of complicating factors with drug testing, but one that people should be aware of is that oral dosing is different. And when you take cannabis orally, you get the response C, the red curve down at the bottom. There is no peak at all, no sharp peak. There is a gradual low plateau going up to somewhere between 6 and 10 nanograms over a period of hours, and then declining again. Very different characteristic. That's something else to be aware of here. If you're looking for signs of impairment, then spiking THC, blood THC, is the thing to look at. And so there have been a lot of accident studies. On one end on this, there have actually been many, in fact, you can see here listed all the studies that have been done of driving fatalities, where they've looked in the blood, in people's systems to see what bloods were detectable, or what drugs were detectable, and to see whether the people who died in the accident were somehow responsible for that accident. And these are fairly sophisticated studies, and when they do them, they try to come up with a risk ratio. And they say, they look at the different categories, and the people who have no drugs at all in the system have a standard risk ratio of 1. If you have a odds ratio, that's in the last column. If you have an odds ratio above 1, it means your risk of being responsible for the accident, having caused the accident, is increased. And if it's lower than 1, that means you have less than normal odds for causing the accident. Now, what they look for in these kinds of odds ratios is when you get up around 5 or 6, that's considered significant danger. And if you will look at these studies, in the second column, this shows what happens when you find alcohol in people's blood. And these studies, we've got about a dozen of them here, covering thousands and thousands of drivers. consistently, when they test for alcohol at levels of drunkenness, that is over 0.08 to 0.1% of blood alcohol is the threshold for DUI. You find you get odds ratios on the order of 5 and 6, typically. Okay? Now, when you look at those with THC in their blood, just the presence of THC, you get a totally different thing. Here's one that had, the first study up there actually had a risk ratio of 2, but you'll notice there's 3 or 4 studies there where they get a risk ratio under 1. These people are behaving as if they're safer than normal drivers. Why might that be? It might be because they drive more slowly. That's what these studies tend to conclude. Now, there were a couple of studies, and they're down there in the middle, which are marked with urine in parentheses in the last column, where instead of looking at THC in blood, they actually looked at the metabolite, the urine metabolite that they do the testing on the drivers for Department of Transportation. And you can see when they looked at that, the odds ratio was basically 1. There was no difference in the accident culpability for people who tested positive in urine for marijuana. None at all. Yet we are testing millions of drivers in the United States and judging them unfit to drive if they test positive for marijuana. Let me point out one other important thing here. There's one study, and it's the third one from the bottom, the Australian study by Drum, where they tried to discriminate. They looked at THC in blood, but they discriminated between those who had high levels of THC, above 5 nanograms. Who were on that peak that I was showing before, shortly after you smoked. And they checked between those and those who had smaller levels. And when they discriminated like that, they found that at the high level, with above 5 nanograms in your system, you had, in fact, a high odds ratio of close to 6.6, similar to drunken driving. So, when you have very high when you have high levels of THC corresponding to that first peak that I showed you before, that is fairly good evidence of DUI. And the bottom line is explained right here. That in general, the detection of marijuana metabolite, THC, COOH, the stuff they look for in urine, has no correlation to risk or safety. But if you have THC in your blood, and that's all I can tell you, there's some THC in the blood, it's a slightly elevated risk comparable to alcohol at 0.05%, which is legal. All right, it's about a 2 or 3. All right, slightly elevated risk. If your THC is above 5 nanograms, it's similar to being drunk.
That is not so.
In the blood. Hold on. Be quiet.
There are all kinds of studies.
Be quiet. Hey, hold on. Questions. THC less than 2 nanograms in the blood. THC, you get no increased risk. And combination of THC and alcohol has a very high DUI risk. And I might add, it's cocaine, amphetamine, and other stimulants have a moderate risk. So that's the end of what I want to say right now. Other than, there's one other thing I like to always say in all of these studies, you know, about drug testing, which is it's never been FDA approved. You know, they've been talking to us, telling us we can't have medical marijuana because it hasn't been FDA approved, safe and effective. Well, the fact is, there have never been any controlled, clinical, double-blind trials showing that drug testing is either safe or effective at improving workplace safety or productivity, and yet it's being forced against people's wills on millions of workers in the United States. You know, I think anybody who, if you judge workers by their urine, they'll get piss poor workers. So.